right. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Jaeeun Kim. She is the Korea Foundation Assistant Professor of Sociology here at University of Michigan. Her illustrious bio is included in the folder. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Kim.
It feels a little weird to get in a classroom because I don't really get this when I give lecture to my students. As Min introduced me, I am an assistant professor in sociology at University of Michigan, and I'm a sociologist studying international migration, ethnicity, nationalism, national identity from a comparative perspective. And I am really happy to have a chance to talk about ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China to you because they are the kind of a Korean population outside the Korean Peninsula who are not really well known to people outside Korea. Well, so I was told that I have about 45 minutes just to give you a speech and some lecture about these two populations, very complicated historical context, etc., and complicated immigration politics. I think I'm probably gonna go over maybe a little bit, maybe 45 to 50 minutes. I'm gonna have maybe 10-minute Q&A session, but please just really feel free to ask questions if there are things that are not really unclear to you, because it's a little complicated. I just had to combine two lectures into one, so I may have to go over a little bit fast, and maybe there are gonna be something that you don't really, you just can't quite understand if you're not really familiar with the material at first. Again, also, I found that actually we have perhaps a 15-minute break after my lecture, and if you still, can take more of me, even after me just talking on and on, for an hour, then I'm gonna just, stick around a little bit so that you can ask me questions, right? All right, thanks. So I guess, I am a sociologist, right? So not just a historian, not just a person who studies Korea. I'm a sociologist studying migration, national identity, etc. So I sort of set up the goal for today's lecture. So on the one hand, I want you to learn a little bit about certainly these two Korean populations in Japan and Northeast China, and their sort of very complicated relationship with South and North Korea, and how we somehow ended up here, right? So it requires some historical understanding of the colonial occupation context, and also Cold War politics, and also globalization in Northeast Asian context. But I also want to talk a little bit about how we can actually situate this particular case in the sort of broader universe of cases that relate to international migration, national identity, all those different things, so that we can sort of understand the phenomenon from a comparative perspective. We can sort of think about compare, for instance, Korean-Japanese relationship with Korea, with Korean-American relationship with South Korea, etc., with which you might be a little more familiar. So before actually I start talking about these two particular populations, ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China, I sort of want to situate the case in the broader context, a broader sociological understanding of how national identity works, how international migration works, or how international migration poses some challenges to our understanding of national identity, etc., right? So if we think about the sort of a state, the nation state that we live, we tend to think, okay, so we are all sort of equal citizens in the country, in democratic countries, etc., right? But if we think about it, the people who sort of live in that particular territory may have different understandings of their belonging to that particular country, their membership in that particular country, right? So there are, the boundary of citizens certainly, right? Perhaps the legal citizens, for instance, in the United States who have American passports, right? But especially in the states like in the United States, we have a lot of immigrant population who may not be really legal citizens, but perhaps who have still permanent legal status. So they somehow live here more or less permanently, do certain things, go to school, have jobs, pay taxes, etc., right? So sociologists call call them sort of denizens. They are sort of residing in particular territory, more or less permanently. They belong to that. Okay, so should I? Okay, belong to that country to a certain degree, but they may not be really legal citizens, right? And also we have people like, maybe they are incorporated into the labor market, so they work, but their legal status may not be really quite clear in a way. They do not really live in this country permanently with a legal status, right? So they are more sort of incorporated as workers, and their membership in that particular country would be a little less clear, right? And even within the boundary of citizens, we have people like who feel like they belong to the American nation, for instance, perhaps more than others. And there are going to be people who are certainly legal citizens, but who do not really quite that subjective identity as American citizens, American sort of members of the American nation. That can sort of apply to other contexts as well. So if we think about some ethnic minority, right? If we think about Israel, for instance, about 20% of Israeli citizens are actually Arab Israelis, right? But because Israel sort of defines itself as a Jewish country, Arab Israelis may feel like they are Israeli citizens, but maybe not really, belong to the Israeli nation to the same extent as like Jewish Israeli citizens would feel like it, right? So something like that. So there are sort of multiple levels of membership and sense of belonging to a certain country. And scholars, like sociologists who study international migration, national identity, they sort of studied this relationship, right? So what is the relationship between the state and its internal others, right? So immigrants, ethnic minorities, they are certainly within the state, members of the state, but do not really quite belong to, or do not quite feel like they belong to the really inside members of the nation, right? But you can think about a very different configuration too. So in a way, we can think about the kind of a situation where there is a population out there. They sort of like live more or less permanently outside the territory of the state, but they are somehow, for some reasons, considered to be part of the nation. So again, if I just give the example of Israeli state, right? Jewish diasporas, right? I mean, they somehow feel like they belong, they have some kind of a membership or sense of belonging to the Israeli state, perhaps to very different degrees, right? And also Israeli state would feel like Jewish diasporas kind of part of the Israeli nation, again, like to different degrees, right? And maybe that sense of membership and belonging may change. Different people may have a very different idea about what that should be, exactly what that relationship should be. So in that sense, we can sort of think about two different configurations, two different kind of membership politics. So one, the relationship between the state and internal others, like immigrants or ethnic minorities. The other, the relationship between state and its external members, like some kind of diaspora population, etc. Right? And what we are going to focus on today is the sort of second configuration, because today I want to talk about the very complicated relationship between North and South Korea and ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China. All right? Any questions so far? Okay, so let me just provide some historical context. This is necessary because ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China, they have a very different origin, for instance, from Korean Americans here. Came here after perhaps like early 1960s as immigrants with South Korean passports, right? So in a way, so they may have become American citizens later, but their relationship with South Korea is relatively clear. This is not the case for ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China. And it is because most of them, their origin actually sort of dates all the way back to the colonial period. So Korea was Japan's colony, like in the first half of the 20th century. And during the colonial period, a lot of people sort of migrated to Japan. And what was called Manchuria. So that later became China. Back then it was not quite clear. It was a sort of a contested borderland between the Japanese Empire and China, and a lot of Koreans just sort of settled there. And Japanese Empire collapsed, right, in the mid-century, and a lot of people came back to the colonization process was incomplete in a way. So about like 2 million actually remained in Northeast China, and 600,000 remained in Japan. So if you think about like the Korean population, it's actually a lot when compared to the native population. And as you can see, the border changed radically after that, right? So the Japanese Empire collapsed. North and South Korea were created in 1948. In China, there was, this like PRC, People's Republic of China, the communist government. So basically, the macro historical context and borders changed a lot. People moved around, and that created a very complicated situation.
Who came back? Is there a distinction made now after 50, 60, 70 years? They say, oh, those people came back to Korea. Do people still remember that? Their neighbors or their friends? They distinguish that? Or
Not so much, because actually the size of the colonial migration was very big, so it was not really considered as such a distinctive phenomenon. But partly because what happened after that, now people certainly make a distinction between like native South Koreans or North Koreans and ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China, but also very differently. So basically, because of this cultural context, etc., although they were both colonial era migrants, what happened after that really sort of put them in a very different path in terms of their national identity, their citizenship situation, their relationship with South Korea and North Korea too. So I want to start talking about like the situation of ethnic Koreans in Japan, and this is sort of like a subtitle of that session. So I just put it like "Who owns the nation? North-South competition and Koreans in Japan like during the Cold War." So basically here I'm focusing on like what happened during the Cold War period, like in the 1960s and 70s, how North and South Korea competed to win over ethnic Koreans in Japan, and what kind of consequences it sort of generated after that, right? And also, certainly, the Japanese policies toward its own ethnic minority population, which were sort of their colonial subjects before, that certainly constitutes an important puzzle here. And because this like ethnic Koreans in Japan, I mean, their situation is very, very complicated. It's almost like mind-boggling to like people outside that context. So I want to sort of start with this particular like sports star, just to give you some sense of this sort of a complicated situation. So I'm here. A lot of people are football fans, so you may not really know like this particular person, but he's a kind of a sort of like a soccer star. I don't really know if I should say like in Japan or South Korea or North Korea, because so his name is Jung Dae-se. He's third generation Korean immigrant in Japan, right? But he still holds South Korean citizenship, which he inherited like from his grandparents, and he has been playing soccer for professional teams in South Korea and Japan. But he actually sees North Korea as his fatherland, right? So sort of subjectively. And then he actually played for the North Korean national team in 2014 FIFA World Cup in Brazil. So actually the picture here, right, the left one, so he's Jung Dae-se, and it is like he's crying because that was like right before the game. The North Korean national anthem was playing. He was sort of overwhelmed by the emotion, so he he cried a lot, and it was actually broadcast pretty broadly, right? So that's a picture of him, and he's sort of like in a belovingly sort of called by South Korea soccer fans as like Inmin Rooney. Here Inmin means like people's Rooney. Rooney refers to Wayne Rooney, the guy here. Like he's also a very famous soccer player in Manchester United. They look alike, people think, and also their soccer stars are pretty similar. I mean, certainly Jung Dae-se does not really look like David Beckham. So I mean, he looks a little more like Wayne Rooney. So Well, so this person is here, very complicated. We are sort of like a puzzle. Why is he doing that, right? And there are sort of two puzzles here. I mean, he's a third generation Korean in Japan, right? Why does he not hold the Japanese citizenship? That's weird in a way. I mean, if we sort of think about Korean American situation here, right? And also, why does he see like North Korea, like from our perspective, it's a sort of a pariah state, so poor, authoritarian, etc. Why does he see North Korea as his own fatherland, right? So that's another puzzle. And I want to explain sort of some historical context that can actually explain this complicated, subjective identity and also legal citizenship, cultural belonging. So after the Japanese Empire collapsed, they were colonial subjects before 1945, right? What are they going to become, right? That was a sort of question. And the Japanese government decided to sort of radically exclude ethnic Koreans from the reconstituted Japanese citizen, right? So before they were considered Japanese nationals because they were colonial subjects, of course not equal, but still Japanese nationals. But after the collapse of the empire, the Japan sort of decided, okay, so we are now nation state, not anymore the empire. It's better for the colonial subjects in Japan. It's better for them to go back to Korea. So we would promote repatriation. If you want to stay, we are not going to give you citizenship, right? So that was just basically what happened. And what was really interesting was that so they sort of like became stateless, like in officially 1952, because they were stripped of their Japanese citizenship in 1952 when Japan, signed this San Francisco Peace Treaty with the United States and Allied forces. Interestingly, neither North Korea nor South Korea actually objected to this enfranchisement of Koreans in Japan. They just became stateless, but North and South Korea did not really protest. No, they should be Japanese nationals, right? Because they sort of considered that as a sort of a neo-colonial affront to their own sort of newly obtained independence, right? So we fought really hard to become independent nations. We forcefully became Japanese during the colonial period. Now we are independent nations. So of course you should not call our people like Japanese, right? That was a kind of rationale behind it. But the problem was, North and South Korea, they were created in 1948. They fought the civil war between 1950 and 53, right? They did not recognize each other. They only saw like themselves as the only legitimate Korean state in the Korean Peninsula, right? So the enemy should be gone, right? So basically that competition sort of extended to ethnic Koreans in Japan, right? So they both sort of tried to win over ethnic Koreans in Japan to their own side for security and legitimacy, right? So in a way, if you think about how close it is, right? Japan is just right next to Korea. You of course really do not want to have very sort of subversive population in that like a close vicinity. And also in terms of legitimacy, right? South Korea does not recognize North Korea as a legitimate country, right? So somehow recognizing Koreans in Japan, they are North Koreans, it is not really good for their legitimacy claim because we are the only legitimate country in the Korean Peninsula, which also applied to North Korea, right? So that was just basically the situation. So the Japanese policy created this large political vacuum in a way, and then North and South Korea fought really hard to win ethnic Koreans in Japan over to their side, right? And they did it in a really in different ways. They actually mobilized very different strategies. I cannot really go into too much detail here because we do not really have that much time. So I would be happy to answer questions later. But let me just give it my try. So, but here the key is all of these that happened in the Cold War period had enormous consequences on their very complicated national identity, citizenship status, and cultural belonging. So interestingly, and I can talk about why later if there is a question, but North Korea garnered much stronger support than South Korea, which is perhaps a little incredible, from the present perspective. But back then, North Korea was doing much better in many different ways. It had more legitimacy, etc. So North Korea was sort of, in a way, more popular, seen as more legitimate by a lot of ethnic Koreans in Japan. And North Korea their policy toward ethnic Koreans in Japan was more like, well, Japan, it's sort of like our previous colonial occupier. If North and South Korea reunited, under our leadership certainly, then they should be repatriated, right? So because that's their real homeland. And also Koreans in Japan back then just suffered a lot of discriminations. They obviously did not have citizenship, as I explained earlier, and also in their everyday interactions, they were just really considered sort of as a second class, still former colonial subject. So North Korea, in a way, welcome them, right, as a safe haven. So North Korea sort of presented itself as a safe haven where these ethnic Koreans, their co-ethnic population in the former metropole who suffer a lot of discrimination, find some kind of comfort, right? So they actually launched this repatriation campaign between 1959 and 1967. And as you can see from the photo here, this is just a lot of people sort of going back to North Korea to just really live there, between 1959 and 1967, almost 80,000 Koreans actually decided to go to North Korea, sort of repatriate. And I just put air quote because actually 90% of ethnic Koreans in Japan originally came from the southern part of the Korean peninsula. So in a way, it was not really quite a return, right? Because they were not really going back to their hometown, right? They were just going back to North Korea because but North Korea was considered as the fatherland, so it was sort of considered repatriation, and it was sort of huge success for North Korea, and also welcomed by ethnic Koreans in Japan back then because their lives in Japan was so miserable in a way because of the discrimination and all those different things. And also North Korea sort of created this national school system across the ethnic Korean enclaves in Japan. So it was a sort of different school system from the Japanese public school system, but because the Japanese public school system was very discriminatory against ethnic minority Koreans in Japan, this school system was also hugely popular among ethnic Koreans in Japan. So because they sort of could get the education, they could get sort of the supportive social network. They learned about how to be proud of their Korean identity, etc. All of those things that were not really quite taught in Japanese public schools. So that again sort of became the means to sort of build this popularity and support for North Koreans among ethnic Koreans in Japan. And the soccer play, the school is still there, although the size is much smaller. And the soccer player that I mentioned, he went to that school, right? So his parents, for instance, South Korean citizens, second generation Korean immigrants in Japan, but still decided to send their kid to this particular school because that's where you can sort of learn about your national roots, your national culture, to be proud of that, etc. Right? And certainly that sort of creates this identity that, okay, so I'm proud like North Korean citizen, right? South Korea was a kind of underdog in the first part of this competition, as I explained a little bit, but it sort of started to win over more Koreans starting in the mid-1960s. And the watershed movement came with this 1965 Japan-South Korea bilateral treaty. So if you think about this, so the Japanese Empire collapsed in 1945, and I'm talking about 1965. So basically, actually, ethnic Koreans in Japan were legally stateless for 20 years, right? They did not really have citizenship. Their residence status in Japan was very, very insecure and precarious because of that. And finally, this bilateral treaty between Japan and South Korea came. And South Korea, because they wanted to win over ethnic Koreans from the North Korean side, they sort of lobbied the Japanese government. So the decision was like, okay, so the Japanese government would grant permanent residence status to ethnic Koreans in Japan if they identify themselves as South Koreans. So you cannot just identify yourself as North Koreans or just Koreans. You should be explicitly identifying yourself as South Koreans by registering as South Koreans, getting South Korean passport, etc. And that certainly created a lot of incentives for Koreans who sort of, okay, so whatever it is, I need permanent residence status certainly. I need to send my kids to school. I need to get some good jobs, etc. So they certainly started to identify with South Korean passports, right? So that sort of created a motivation. The other thing that the South Korean government did was to sort of like discriminate against pro-North Koreans. So because about like 90% of ethnic Koreans in Japan actually came from South Korea, they had a lot of family members still in South Korea, right? So obviously they want to, pay visits, send money, because back then South Korea was just really, really poor country. Also perhaps invite their family over to Japan, etc. But if they did not identify themselves explicitly as South Korean citizens, South Korean government just basically banned them from doing that, right? And that certainly was a sort of forceful measure. I mean, if you remember, South Korea, like North Korea, was an authoritarian country back then. So they, for instance, persecuted the king members of these people, like who did not identify themselves as South Koreans in South Korea, and also refused to issue passports or all kinds of official identification documents if they did not really identify themselves as South Koreans. So it was a more sort of a coercive measure, but that was certainly hugely successful. So South Korea sort of started to win this competition, and a lot of people sort of started to identify themselves, at least on the paper, as South Korean citizens. And this is why, again, like the soccer players' parents actually have South Korean citizenship, right? So they may not really identify strongly with South Korea as a country, but they would still get South Korean passports because it's convenient, right? Yeah, sure. That's a really good question, because as we will learn soon, the South Korean government attitude towards ethnic Koreans in China was completely different, right? But in this case, because the cultural competition was so fierce, they were sort of for their own security. Like so many, like 600,000 Koreans in Japan identify themselves as North Koreans seems a little too dangerous to South Koreans, right? So by claiming them as South Koreans, I mean, if you're South Korean citizens, that also means that actually they are subjected to the government sanctions and all these different things, right? I mean, you cannot really, for instance, punish Japanese citizens or North Korean citizens, but you can certainly do that, like with South Korean citizens, right? So it was more sort of like a surveillance measure too, and also there was really no, danger of a lot of ethnic Koreans sort of trying to come to South Korea. South Korea was such a poor country. But this situation is going to change in terms of South Korea's relationship with ethnic Koreans in China in the 1990s and 2000s. So that actually we're going to talk about pretty soon. Thanks.
Any of your research suggested
briefly, so here the ethnic Koreans in Japan are sometimes called like a diaspora without homeland because their identity is very complicated. So if you identify with North Korea, there's certainly the danger of discrimination, persecution, and ostracization, especially in the contemporary period. Just think about like what it would feel like if you travel with North Korean passport. It's gonna be a disaster. You have to explain yourself all the time in the immigration desk, etc. Right? So a lot of people obtain South Korean citizenship, but as I said, for a lot of people, that's just really a passport. That does not really come with deep subjective identification with the South Korean country. And many of them are actually culturally almost Japanese as a result of assimilation. Part of it is certainly because of the sort of like discrimination against Koreans. So a lot of Koreans would rather choose to use Japanese style names rather than their official Korean style names because it would have consequences in their everyday interactions with other Japanese citizens, etc. So they are culturally Japanese, right? So that certainly feels like, okay, so I almost feel like Japanese, but I'm not really considered like fully Japanese by other Japanese citizens. I do not really feel it that way either, right? So there are a lot of sort of identity issues going on here. They do not really quite feel like they belong to North Korea, nor to South Korea, nor to Japan, right?
Within, if we talk about the people living in Japan, within one family, does it tend to be uniform that all the generations in this family feel more this way, but maybe another family feel this way? Or does each generation have a different level of identification?
Right, that's a really good question too. Certainly, there are sort of family differences, etc. Because maybe if parents send their kids to that like a particular school, the kids are probably are likely to identify with North Korea to a certain extent. But certainly there is generational difference, right? So in the parents' generation, North Korea was really bad. They are really grateful for what North Korea did for ethnic Koreans in Japan. Younger generation certainly do not really feel that. There is a strong anti-North Korean sort of opinion in Japan, and they are certainly affected by that. So there is actually a really good movie, which you can find, I guess, from Netflix. It's called like Dear Pyongyang. The Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea. So that is sort of made by a Korean Japanese director who actually studied here at NYU, like film studies, and her father is actually very active, high-ranking officer in this pro-North Korea plantation. So he is sort of very loyal to North Korea, but his daughter is very ambivalent about her identification with North Korea, and so there is this like really interesting. It's a documentary, right? Interesting conversation between the daughter and the father, how they sort of compromise their differences, to try to understand their difference across the generation, etc. So that's a very sort of moving film which I actually shoot to my students. So you might want to check it.
Example, I teach here in upper school. 2 years ago, I had students at Clay Middle School whose father was born in Japan from Korean parents. He went to Colonial for Japanese company, and they sent him to New Zealand Army to work. So the girls had Korean names, but they insisted on speaking only Japanese. And they Clay was a very large Korean population, and they did not assimilate those kids. They were just Japanese students, and they were kind of lost in that
Right.
community.
Right. So that's a sort of the complexity of diaspora, and you will find something similar even on the Korean American population there too, depending on the context. But that's even more complicated, politically charged in the situation that I'm in Japan because of all this. So I think I still have like 5 to 10 minutes, right? So let's just move to the Koreans in China. So here the subtitle I put is like a reluctant embrace and struggles for inclusion. So there's just like a strong contrast between what happened to Koreans in Japan and what happened to Koreans in China. So in this case, South Korea did not really try to win them over, right? It was more sort of a reluctant embrace, and Korean Chinese struggled really hard for inclusion for all kinds of different reasons. And this happened in the post-Cold War period. So what happened, what I explained before, mostly sort of unfolded in the 1960s and 70s. The contemporary situation is a little bit different, but what I'm going to explain now sort of started to happen in the 1990s and 2000s because their history was different. So let me just briefly explain what happened to Koreans who remained in Northeast China after the collapse of the Japanese Empire during the Cold War period. So the Chinese policies toward ethnic Koreans in China was completely different from the Japanese policy toward ethnic Koreans in Japan. So they were incorporated relatively successfully into the People's Republic of China. So they were collectively granted Chinese citizenship right away. And also, they were recognized as one of the official national minority. China sort of considered itself as a sort of multinational state, right? And Korea is like one of their officially recognized like 55 minority populations. And also they were given this like autonomous prefecture in Northeast China. So you put it like on the map here. It's an autonomous prefecture. So Korean is the official language in that, administrative unit, etc., right? So in a way, their sort of legal incorporation into the People's Republic of China, Communist China, was relatively smooth. And partly because of that, they could actually maintain their ethno-cultural characteristics like over generation, like a third generation and fourth generation, especially the Korean language. And this actually had a huge impact on what kind of a migration path they later tried to adopt after China opened itself, because they still kept their sort of changed in the post-Cold War period, starting in late 1990s. So Korean Chinese actually started to migrate pretty intensively, basically to weather through China's economic transformation, right? From the communist planned economy to market economy, very globalized economy, right? So they went everywhere in a way, but the most popular destination was South Korea. And you can understand why. I mean, back then, especially in the 1990s, now China is really big, but still like in the 1990s, the wage level was much higher in South Korea. They can actually, many of them speak Korean more comfortably than Mandarin, like the Chinese, right? So in a way, they actually could migrate to South Korea, and because they could speak Korean, they were in a more sort of favorable position than other immigrants in South Korea, like Bangladesh, coming from, or other just Chinese, Thai people, Nepalese, Malaysians. We have a lot of immigrants in South Korea, but they cannot really speak Korean. But Korean Chinese actually can speak Korean, right?
Was there any support system when people came back after World War II, after the Korean War, at different times? The government said, if you are coming here, we want to give you an orientation, we want to help you with our schools, we want to kind of guide you, get back into things, or just good luck?
Good luck. Yeah. South Korea was so poor, so it could not really even take care of its own citizens. So certainly not for repatriates, right? And especially in this case, they were actually considered not necessarily coming back, but they were considered immigrants. That's what I'm going to talk about. Again, let me sort of go back to a little more sort of sociological understanding of this phenomenon. And this phenomenon is actually considered by sociologists who study international migration some subset of international migration phenomenon. So they call it like an ethnic return migration. So it's a little bit different from other types of immigration because the ethnicity between immigrant population and the native population is kind of the same, right? So in a way, that's external members, like those who are considered somehow to be part of the nation, sort of start to come back, right? Then what happens? Just basically, what happens if external members become immigrants, right? So that's why it is called a sort of ethnic return migration. But again, like people put quotation mark here, like a return, because it may not be really the return, like technically speaking, right? I mean, maybe your grandparents come from South Korea. I've never been to South Korea, so it's not really necessarily a return. In this case, a lot of them can speak Korean, but in many cases of ethnic return migration, that's not really the case. This actually happens a lot. So you may have heard about like a Japanese Brazilian or Japanese Peruvian go back to Japan to work. A lot of ethnic Germans in former Soviet countries, like in Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, they sort of go back to Germany, but they don't speak single German, right? Also, a lot of Argentine citizens who are the descendants of Italy or Spanish origin. After the financial crisis in Argentina, they sort of started to go back to Italy or Spain because the economy was much better than like there in that country, right? So this is a very sort of a common phenomenon that you can find across the world, and the Korean Chinese return to South Korea was also sort of a part of it. But as I mentioned here and there a little bit, their treatment in South Korea was not really sort of like very welcoming. So this ethnic return migration actually puts the state in a difficult spot. So on the one hand, it's a homeland, right, for people coming back. On the other hand, it sort of becomes the immigration state, right? So part of South Korea sort of wants to function more as like a homeland, welcoming people coming back, returning. On the other hand, part of the South Korean government sort of wants to act more like an immigration state, right? So we are gonna keep our labor market under our control so that citizens can find work better than immigrants coming from China, right? Something like that. So on the one hand, there was a lot of talk in terms of rhetoric, like, oh, welcome, welcome, right? But you are just really part of us, you are part of the Korean nation. But that was more sort of the political rhetoric. In terms of the immigration citizenship policies, there was really sort of like initially no preferential treatment for ethnic Koreans coming from China. They were just really considered like other foreign immigrants, right? And all those like policies that would control their legal immigration, deportation, all those different things. And also they suffered some discrimination in their everyday interaction with South Korean natives because they were considered a little bit different. They had different accents. They grew up in a different country, so certainly there's a cultural difference between South Korean natives and Korean Chinese. So sometimes they were just really called as Chinese, which they took as a great offense, right? In a way, because they were so proud of the fact that they kept their ethno-cultural identity in sort of a foreign country, in a way, the Han majority country, and then we now finally go back to Korea, and then they call me Chinese, right? How crazy is that, right? So there was a lot of sort of, the relationship sort of changed from the kind of mutual discovery, welcome, welcome, finally, to sort of very much like a mutual disillusionment and a lot of conflicts. And what sort of became a really contentious lightning rod was this CoEthnics Abroad Act in 1999. So basically, the South Korean Congress created this law, and according to this law, ethnic Koreans, regardless of their citizenship, so you can be Japanese citizen, you can be American citizens, but if you are ethnically Korean, we're going to treat you differently in terms of immigration. So you can have different visa status, you can come to South Korea more easily, more freely, you can invest more freely, you can find jobs more freely than other foreigners, etc. So that was basically the content of this particular law. But the South Korean government excluded Korean Chinese from the eligibility for this law. And if you think about it, Korean Chinese are actually the kind of population who would need most than other ethnic Koreans, because they actually wanted to come and work in South Korea. That was really considered very essential for, like sending money back to their family in China, etc. So somehow this discrimination was just really considered, okay, so we cannot put up with this anymore, right? So last slide. So there was a lot of sort of challenge and protest to this exclusion. So this is a sort of photo from that particular protest against this exclusion in the CoEthnics Abroad Act. And this placard that this woman is holding, it just basically says it's the daughter who got married to a rich family on your daughter. So here, Korean Chinese are sort of comparing themselves to a daughter who got married to a poor family, in this case China, right? So because they sort of consider, so we are coming back from the poor country, not the United States, not Japan, that's why you are discriminating us, right? So I am still the same daughter of this Korean nation, but because I got married to a poor family, you are discriminating me, right? You're not really treating me as the same daughter. So that was sort of like a metaphor here. And that metaphor certainly had a lot of power and resonance. And so finally, the Constitutional Court sort of ruled that this particular CoEthnics Abroad Act and the exclusion of Korean Chinese from the eligibility criteria as unconstitutional for all kinds of reasons. So their protest was relatively successful. Still, they do not really feel like they totally belong to South Korea, even after some of them obtained South Korean citizenship. So again, here, I guess what actually this case, both Korean Japanese case and Korean Chinese case, tell us is that, we talk about Korean diasporas. There are 7 million Korean diaspora all around, and that sort of creates an illusion that somehow there's no disputes or contestation over actually who belong to the Korean nation, who belong to the Korean diaspora, and somehow they are treated equally by the South Korean or North Korean state, which actually really is not the case. It's a sort of object of contestation and disputes and challenged by all kinds of different actors involved. I would say at this point it's more sort of economic. It's more sort of an issue of labor market control. But certainly when the Ministry of Justice had to provide its own rationale why they try to exclude the Korean Chinese from that particular CoEthnics Abroad Act eligibility, they said, for instance, well, there's a danger. For instance, what if North Korean spy present themselves as Korean Chinese, because they would perhaps go to Northeast China and then maybe create some kind of paper identity and come to South Korea, etc. So that was certainly part of the rationales, but it was more sort of tangential and more like an excuse. The main reason was just very much economic. But nowadays, the South Korean government sort of found that actually it's not really even politically tenable. The excluding Korean Chinese right away is not really politically tenable, and perhaps economically not that wise either, because the South Korean economy certainly, like all kinds of developed countries, cannot really operate without cheap immigrant population. And in a way, Korean Chinese who are willing to work at cheaper wage than native South Koreans, but also perhaps more capable in the sense that because they can speak Korean, etc. Maybe having some of them in South Korea may not be really that bad. So they sort of changed the policy from sort of more control-based to regulation-based. So it's more liberal in terms of issuing visas, etc. This is more like the Japanese policies toward Peruvian or Brazilian Japanese. Okay, thank you. So this was my presentation, but I think I can still have maybe 5 minutes, like a Q&A session, then I'll stick around. Yeah, sure. Sure. So actually, there's like this book written by we call them like a Chinese Korean. Actually, so I just sort of casually use the term like a Korean Japanese here and there, but actually a lot of scholars don't use that because it is a little difficult for us to sort of imagine this hyphenated identity. So like in terms of Korean American, right? I mean here you can be Korean, you can be American, you can be both, right? In a way. But that concept just doesn't really quite work in the Japanese context. So Korean Japanese, that term does not really quite work. So they sort of call themselves as like a Zainichi Koreans. Zainichi is a sort of Japanese word just meaning residing in Japan, like a resident in Japan. And if you think about it, that's a really weird word, like for like third generation or first generation, Korean who were basically Japan was the only country that they have ever known, right? But they still call themselves as Chinese Koreans. And the situation of Chinese Koreans, like before the repatriation, so this book like written by Sonia Ryang, she's an anthropologist, like working here, but she actually was one of those like Chinese Koreans who actually went to this pro-North Korean school, etc. Later, she became an anthropologist in the United States, and her book is just really about like this particular population, and she sort of offers some evidence that shows the sort of a living condition of Chinese Koreans before the repatriation. And if you sort of take a look at, for instance, the job description of people, for instance, who decided to repatriate, like a lot of them are unemployed, or they might be sort of waste picker. Is it the right word to say that? Like waste pickers and also a lot of like scrap matter, pickers, etc. Because they were discriminated, they were not really, and many of them may not really could not perhaps speak Japanese that freely if they were first generation Koreans. They were not really educated that well, discriminated in the public education. So many of them sort of had to rely on the kind of welfare from the government, which was also why the Japanese government really wanted the Koreans just to be gone. So their academic situation is just certainly very bad, and also they did not really have citizenship. They also did not really know how much longer they could live in Japan because their legal status was just basically none, right? They were just renewing their foreigners registration like year by year.
Anthropology is not that fun, so I like that kind of thing. My question is about when somebody dies, I know that burial is very important. Cremation, but it's important the location, physically. And people will pay a lot of money if there's an opportunity sometimes to bring those remains back. So that's modern times when people trash people maybe have money to do it. But in these other times of history, colonial times, so on, what happened when someone died? Was it possible for people living in China or the people living in Japan to have a loved one remains go back to Korea, or was that treated as no, you are living in Japan, you're living in Chinese state? You know what happened?
I don't think it is regulated by the government sanctions or laws or anything like that. I know that like the burial issues and or paying the visit to the family gravesite, etc., was a very important issue, for instance, for Chinese Koreans, like Koreans in Japan. So that was actually also one of the reasons why people sort of like started to adopt, like to get issued the South Korean passport, because they wanted to, okay, so my mom died, I couldn't really be there, but I at least want to pay visit to her gravesite. That's a very culturally really, really important thing. If I don't really identify myself as South Korean, they're not gonna give me passport. I cannot really travel, right? So something like that. So that was a sort of more important issue. What I see is that like nowadays, even the first generation who is still alive in both in Korea and China, they would not try to, for instance, be buried after they die in Korea, partly because like all their sons and daughters and grandsons and daughters are in Korea or China, so they just wanna make it easy like for them to visit, etc. So they wouldn't really try that, but they would still perhaps, especially if they are rich and men like with some kind of standing in the family, they would send a lot of money to the family back home so that they can do certain things with their family gravesite, etc. Yeah, sure. So Osaka is certainly one of the sort of biggest sort of a Koreatown area in Japan. There are actually, you can find a lot of like people like coming from Jeju Island. So a lot of people actually from Jeju Island, like that, you know, the island at the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula, went to Japan partly because it was even poorer during the colonial period, and also it's closer like to Japan. And that's also part of the reason why a lot of Chinese Koreans' support for North Korea was greater. You may have heard about this sort of a massacre in Jeju Island in 1948, right before the establishment of South Korea. So that was more sort of like the clash between like a leftist guerrilla and anti-communist South Korean government. But in the process, the South Korean government ended up actually killing a lot of civilians in Jeju Island, sort of, you know, considering them as pro-communist like supporters. So certainly when they went to Osaka, or when their relatives heard about what happened to their family back in Jeju Island, they certainly became supporters of North Korea, because the South Korean regime was just really considered a murderer in that sense, very repressive. So Osaka is certainly one of the concentration. Also a lot in Tokyo, especially the Kawasaki. It's a sort of like a city right near Tokyo. So the Kawasaki is and Yokohama. You can find them everywhere, but the Osaka and Kawasaki, those two are probably the biggest concentration.